Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Happiness Index podcast. My name is Matt Phelan. I'm co-founder of the Happiness Index, and I am your host today. I'm here with James Hewitt, who's going to introduce himself in a second. But how are you doing, James?
I'm doing really well, thanks, Matt. I've back into work after a bit of a kind of work holiday mix over in America. So really looking forward to our conversation today.
Yeah, I've got a technical question about that, which I'm going to come back to in a second. But James, please introduce yourself to our listeners.
Well, my name is James Hewitt, and I describe myself as a human performance scientist. That really means I'm fascinated by how we can help people to reach more of their potential with a particular focus on the workplace, but without burning themselves out or compromising their well-being in the process. And that fascination really is decades long now. It started with my own career as a full-time athlete. I used to be a full-time racing cyclist, which was where my passion and curiosity about human performance really started to grow and accelerate. But to cut a long story short, when that career didn't work out, I returned to the UK. I went back to university. I studied sports science before setting up a coaching business. And despite the fact that I wanted to work with elite and professional athletes, I found that the people who paid the bills were these very enthusiastic amateur cyclists who were in London, where I was based at the time, working 80 hours a week, racing 180 kilometers at the weekend. And that was really the genesis of my fascination with the workplace, and really led to a lot of the thinking that I still draw on today about how we can approach work like an endurance activity, balancing effort and recovery, a bit like elite athletes. And I continue to do that work and research today. And a lot of that revolves around speaking, communication, consulting. And I'm also still a visiting fellow at Loughborough University in the UK.
That, James, there's so much stuff there we're going to cover as we go along. But one thing, my technical question I had is, you mentioned like rest, recovery, and managing your process. And the technical bit is, I know you're in America launching a book, but you sort of mixed up holiday and the book as well. Is that typically how you might do a holiday, or is that because you had the book launched and you thought you'd put a bit of a holiday on? And is that how you would ideally like your holiday to be?
Yeah, so I mean, there's some really interesting literature around vacations, as our American cousins call it, or holidays, and the duration of the most effective break, but also the content of that break. And if you were to synthesize it, it seems to indicate that shorter breaks can be as effective as longer breaks. So there's some indications that if you look at recovery and some well-being metrics, even cognitive performance measures, that you seem to be able to recover as much in a 3 to 4 day break as you might even in a 3 to 5 week more extended period away from work and other responsibilities. In terms of the characteristics of the most effective breaks, it seems that one of the most important is that you do something that's quite different from day-to-day life, and you also step away from day-to-day responsibilities. It's very intuitive, but sometimes we need to be more proactive about that than we might think. And so for me, I had during that time away some really structured periods where, and by structured, I mean, I was switched off. I was intentional about getting away from day-to-day responsibilities, not checking my emails. We ate out a lot. I was there with my family, with my wife and our 2 kids. But then there was also some work there as well. And actually, the work piece, I was launching the book at a very large leadership conference in Chicago. It's called the Global Leadership Summit. And the organizers were kind enough to invite my family as well. So my wife and kids came along. They got to see me speak, but also we could hang out together. They could meet the other speakers. And particularly as our kids are getting a bit older and I travel a lot, I'm trying to find more and more ways for both my wife and my kids for us to do things together that blend the personal and the professional. And for me, that works very well. There's something called work-life segmentation preference, which we can talk about a bit more detail if you like, but essentially it describes how we each have a preference for how integrated or separated we want our work and the rest of our life to be. And for me, I'm definitely someone who is quite comfortable with that integration. And so being on the road a lot, finding ways to do that travel together is a way that I'm very comfortable with. I like integrating it, and it's a way to spend some quality time together as a family and reduce some of that separation time.
I think that's something really good for our listeners to think about, isn't it? Which is the work-life integration section. And that's what I was trying to understand, if that was typical of you or whether that was just put in because of the destinations. But it sounds like that is something you're conscious of, something that you're trying to do more of. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And so we've been intentional about that a few times, and increasingly in recent years, where particularly with the travel. So whether it's my wife coming with me, kids coming with me, but even just day to day, I'm not super rigid about Monday to Friday, or even kind of daytime working hours. I actually often do a bit of work in the evenings, but it's about trying to be proactive to make sure that there is that blend between effort and recovery, because there is a risk with that integration approach. And it's interesting, when I was at this event, I got to chat with a lot of the speakers, and one of the things that really stood out to me, and it has done before, but this really reconfirmed it, is that often as speakers, communicators, writers, we often end up talking, writing, thinking about the things which we struggle with the most ourselves.
Yeah.
And so as much as I'm comfortable with that integration, and to your question, that is my general way of working and living, there's a risk there. And I know my risk is falling into this trap of continuous connectivity, always on work, not recovering enough, because I love what I do. And unfortunately, there's a risk that you end up overusing that passion. It can become obsessive rather than harmonious.
I think I've seen, I mean, you see that in the entrepreneurial world quite a bit, but I've also seen that in an organization like the Happiness Index, where people tend to come here that are driven. And but most people who work at the Happiness Index normally have had a bad experience in their career, and they feel like they want to put it right for other people, which is an incredible driver. But it could, we often have that problem. I talk a lot about how we have the opposite. When people say, "Oh, if you give people freedom, they won't do any work." My personal experience at the Happiness Index is the opposite, which is where people are really driven and they have freedom. So where they have the purpose and the freedom together, it's almost the opposite. We're like trying to get people to take holiday. We're consciously, we've felt that we had a conversation a few years ago that bank holidays are like the perfect holiday, because quite often your clients are on holiday as well. That thing, you go on holiday, but you come back and maybe there's more emails than you went away. I'm sure everyone has got that. So we created our own bank holiday in the Happiness Index, which was last Friday, actually. So the last August bank holiday, that Monday, we tapped the Friday on before. So we call it a wellbeing bank holiday, even though it could just call it a wellbeing day. But the whole point is we're all off, and we tell our customers that we're off. And I find that it is better than any other day that you could take if you were going to take a year. A day, because it's planned, a bit like Christmas Day or whatever. It's become like that. So I think that intentional bit is the bit that I just wanted to bring out for the listeners there, James. Appreciate that. Sure, touch on the name of your book, Regenerative Performance, and I just want to get a bit of an understanding of what you mean by it versus what maybe other people. The first time that I heard of regenerative was with one of our early clients, which was Vivo Barefoot, and they're a footwear brand in the UK, and they were the first company. They came to us and they explained what they meant by it, and what they meant by it is sustainability, because they're a product design company. They believe sustainability in product, in the world of product and shoes and fashion, wasn't enough. The planet was gone so bad the other way that we need to put more in than we take out. That was their philosophy. And interestingly, before I met you, we would always joke and talk about how connected our world at the Happiness Index was with their product design. And we used to talk about it in terms of their programs and regenerative. We didn't add the word performance on, but we did talk about it from a human perspective, not seeing the phrase that we always used to use, not seeing human beings like a battery that you run and you discard. What do you mean by regenerative performance? And is it totally different to what, for example, a product design company like Vivo would use?
It sounds very much aligned, because fundamentally my premise with regenerative performance is that there's a way to approach performance that isn't extractive, that rather creates these virtuous cycles where, to your point, you can invest and perhaps get more out, rather than just looking at capacity as something that's fixed that you want to extract as much as possible from. And to give you an example of that, often when we think about performance traditionally, it is a mod, and it's an extractive model, which takes the position that we need to just push harder, we need to grind more, we need to just keep going, and if we do that, we'll achieve this peak. And it's the kind of performative model, which you see in movies, for example, and often celebrated on social media. And I think, one of the archetypes of this is what you might describe as hustle culture. It's just about grinding more. It's the late nights, coffee fueled work blocks where you never sleep, etc., etc. Whereas I think there's a way to approach performance, which is actually true sustained high performance, where in a workplace context, you create working environments that support individuals and teams, that actually contribute to them, that build them up, that grow their resources. And that could be psychological resources, emotional resources, even physical resources, like paying people well, for example. And then you're going to get more out of them, but them getting more out of them doing better work is actually going to create more resources for the organization, which they can then invest in both their customers and the people in the organization. And so it creates this positive flywheel effect. And there's some really good evidence to describe that this is possible. And we can see for good and for bad, for example, that leaders have a huge impact on their organization's well-being. If a leader isn't sleeping well, for example, their teams are less likely to sleep well. Conversely, there's some data published recently which indicates that a leader's personal well-being is the #1 predictor of organizational well-being and the #3 predictor of organizational performance. And there's some other research at an individual level from psychology, which was first described by someone called Barbara Fredrickson, which talks about the broaden and build effect and this notion of positive spirals, that when we accumulate resources, things like feeling good, positive mood, what we might describe as positive affect, that has this effect of actually drawing more positive resources to us. It builds us up and actually broadens our cognitive resources, might even improve our performance as well. And so it sounds like we're quite aligned there. It's this idea that actually performance, in my context, can be something that builds us up rather than breaks us down.
I think it's fascinating that point that a leader's well-being and health is an indicator of the teams. And as a parent myself, the first thing I thought of is from a parenting perspective as well. I'm not comparing leadership to parenting, but I guess that's probably the same in a family, isn't it? As parents, like, James, you can tell your kids all day what to do, but the only way really is to showcase stuff, rather than tell. Do you think there's anything in that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it comes down to how we define leadership. Because for me, leadership is about change. It's about perhaps we're influencing someone to shift from one way of thinking to another, maybe one way of behavior to another. Because if you're not taking people from one place to another place, arguably you're not leading at all. And so I think that you could characterize parenting as a form of leadership, because we are influencing our kids and we're taking them from one place, childhood, hopefully into healthy adulthood. And there's all kinds of aspects to that and dimensions. But I see certainly as a parent that the way that I live, that my wife lives, has a huge impact on what our kids think is okay, is good, and whether that comes to well-being behaviours, how we treat others, or otherwise.
So that's really helpful, James. And before we go into the core questions I've got for you today, I have to ask you the question that we ask all our guests, which is, what makes you happy, James?
So for me, it's about having the opportunity to pursue my curiosity. So I don't know if you've come across something called character strengths. It's a framework which describes these characteristics which are really strongly expressed within us. There's 24. We've got a group of signature strengths, and for me, my #1 is curiosity. And so when I get opportunities to use that curiosity to explore things I'm interested in, then that really brings a lot of joy, a lot of positive emotion to me.
That's so interesting, and it's. I didn't say it at the time, but when you were talking about a holiday and being actively switched off, one of the things that I have to switch off is almost my curiosity, because if you think about well-being and happiness, it's not the same, but it's a similar world. Like, even I'm in a restaurant and I'm thinking about the employees and the experience they have. I have to actively turn it off, because if I let my curiosity, which is really high up, I haven't done that list, but it's definitely in the top 5 for me, it can actually stop me switching off. Have you ever had that experience, James?
Oh, absolutely. And the interesting thing about this character strengths model is that there's also this notion of what's called a golden mean. And essentially it describes a sweet spot for the expression of our character strengths. And what you've described or alluded to there sounds like a potential overuse of that curiosity. Obviously, we can also underuse it, which is probably less rare. It's certainly it's less common for me. But yeah, learning to sustain that sweet spot, that golden mean. And I think for me, some of that is around recognizing what characterizes the overuse of that character strength. So that example that you gave is probably a pretty good one, where I'm overthinking about something rather than being present. And that for me is the biggest red flag for the overuse of curiosity for me, is that my mind is drifting off into other things rather than being present with what I should be prioritizing. Where in your case, I've experienced something similar in my case. I should be present with my family or the people I'm with, and instead I'm going down this train of thought, whether it's thinking about the working conditions of the waiting staff or something else in my environment.
Yeah, and I'd love to get your thoughts on the underuse, because I definitely feel it on when in the business, when it's stressful or time sensitive. I'll sometimes look back and think, I wish I'd been more curious. I wish I'd asked why we're doing it that way, or why we still do it that way, or why maybe a client's not happy. And afterwards I've looked back and thought I should have drilled more and been more curious on how that situation arose. Is that a typical example, or have you got some other examples that you could use aware of an underuse or curiosity?
No, I think that's a great example, because when, and it is also a red flag, particularly for me, if I'm starting to track towards maybe not kind of clinical burnout, but I'm seeing this diminished psychological, emotional, even physical energy, then one of the red flags for me is that natural curiosity starts to be blunted. Right. And as you say, I become very task focused. I'm not asking the questions I usually would. And I can feel it in myself. But if you can engage in what's called strength spotting, so you look at where you're using your strengths, how you're using those strengths, and start to develop a vocabulary so that you can describe what optimal use looks like versus overuse or underuse, I think it becomes a lot easier then to attenuate, to kind of stop that slide towards overuse or underuse. And I've certainly found that framework has been a really helpful tool to do that for me, but also teams that I'm part of as well, where you develop a shared vocabulary with the people that you're working with.
I think that's the first takeaway I'm going to give our listeners, is to have this conversation in their teams. Maybe ask each other what strengths you think you each other have, because sometimes your strengths that you think you have are different, and someone might relay a strength to you, and vice versa. So I think that's one of the first takeaways I'm going to give, is people from James's talk so far, is to just have that conversation in the teams. It's useful listening to James and I, it's valuable to us, but go and have that conversation in your teams would be my first takeaway today. James, I just want to go into a really contentious issue that comes from social media for the first question, which is, it feels like there's a million different ways that you can start your day. And every day I log in, there's like, you should do it like this, or you should do it like that, or you should wake up like this, or wake up like that. I don't know if this was a message from the universe, but I was thinking about this question this morning whilst I was making my son breakfast, and I actually cut my finger with a knife, which I felt like it was a mess. Like, I'll show you my little band-aid here so you can see it's not so bad.
I'll do it.
Yeah, I did think like it was the universe of like, just focus on one task at a time. Like, again, it was a presence thing. But regenerative mornings, is there a right way to start the day, James?
But I think the answer is it depends. So one of my biggest bugbears at the moment is this idea that there is this universal optimized morning protocol. And you mentioned social media. If you were to follow many high performance orientated social media accounts, you could easily become convinced that it almost certainly involves waking up at 5 a.m., if not earlier, drinking some type of supplement shake, jumping in an ice bath, maybe a sauna as well, doing some type of meditation routine before anyone else has even got out of bed. And I think the problem is that we all potentially are vulnerable to something called chronotype bias. And there's this really interesting phenomenon that describes how we tend to associate people who wake up early with positive virtues. So we think they're more conscientious. We often think they're high performing. And this has actually been described in workplace research. So for example, employees who arrive at work earlier are rated as higher performing, even if they perform exactly the same level objectively as employees who come in later. So this chronotype bias is real, and there's a lot of different reasons for this, but quite many of them are probably cultural, socio-cultural, from things that have emerged in the past, things we've seen in the past. But the bottom line is, from a biological point of view, it's simply not correct, because we each have a chronotype which describes a biological predisposition towards morningness or eveningness. Now, some people are more strong morning types. These are the people who naturally wake up earlier and go to bed earlier. There are stronger evening types who unleash their brilliance just as the cleaning crew arrives, and then most of us are somewhere in between, maybe with a bias one way or the other. But this difference in chronotype means that there can actually be about 2.5, even more hours difference between when someone would reach the peak levels of alertness. So you could have a scenario where it might take someone until 7:30 in the morning to reach the same level of alertness that a very strong early type might achieve at 5 a.m. So my contention is that when it comes to the hour that we wake up, sustained high performance is less about the specific hour that your alarm goes off. It's more about alignment with your underlying circadian rhythm. Now, I appreciate that's not always possible to achieve. There's different responsibilities, but I would really strongly dissuade people from creating a morning routine based on what a 5 a.m. club influencer has told them, over paying attention to your natural rhythm and what your biology is telling you.
I think that's fascinating, because when we started our first business in 2008, we started employing our first employees in 2009, and the workday started at 9 o'clock. And it was at that point where we didn't really know what happened. And back then, like, if you were late once, you'd get like a warning, and we were just like listening to whatever people said. And just one of our best staff members, she just kept coming in like 5 minutes late. And then eventually we were getting annoyed, she was getting annoyed. And that's when we first brought in flexi time. And although now today it sounds like such a simple thing because so many companies do it, it was such a basic revolution for us, because it just allowed her to be her. And it allowed other people that wanted to come in early to come in early. And then we did have people that came in at 8 and left at 4. But then we had people that came in at 10 and worked till 6, or whatever it was at the time. I can't remember. And the other bias that I think that I've had to get comfortable with is, I'm definitely a morning person. And however, in your social life, if you're someone who likes to go to bed early, you're boring. And that's
Interesting.
other cultural thing. And I've had to get comfortable with the fact that I am someone who wakes up early. I do like to get out. And you know what? When it gets to 10 o'clock, I get tired and I like to go to bed. I'm not one of those people. Like, even if I've got like friends over our house or whatever, I'm just no good after 10 o'clock. It's pointless me being there. So I've had to get over like the social stigma of going, you know what, actually, you guys crack on, I'm going to bed. Because when you're younger, that's seen as like boring. And so I had probably all different types of biases around this as well. But for me, the big takeaway from it, James, is understanding the differences, and that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, recognizing that sometimes we'll need to compromise. We might need to compromise sometimes because of professional responsibilities, personal responsibilities, even things that we want to do, where, there's a great social opportunity and we'll kind of maybe have a nap in the afternoon so we can stay awake a bit later.
Yeah.
But in general, as you say, if we can just become aware of this difference and find ways to accommodate it where we can, and then I think that could have significant benefits for both well-being and for performance.
So this leads me, and that's as a good lead in, actually, James, into this next question around, how do we find a rhythm of effort and recovery? I think like of my dad, he's a farmer. He's one of the hardest working people I know. He's up early. That is part of that job. There are certain things you have to wake up and do earlier if you're a farmer. But he's also one of the best nappers I know. He loves a nap. But I've also got a sister-in-law who's anti-napping. She hates anyone. She hates anyone. She does not like people having a nap in a day. She thinks that's a sin. How do you build like some kind of rhythm for yourself, like within the context of work? So regenerative work days, how does that work, James?
So I think for me, the principle underlying all of this is being aware that we can't always be on, that it's impossible to sustain a very high intensity workload throughout the day. Again, we can see this biologically. So there's a really interesting phenomenon. They're described as ultradian rhythms, and it describes how during 24 hours a day, but most noticeably for us during our conscious hours, we follow these rhythms of alertness, of higher and lower alertness that may be somewhere between 90 and 120 minutes long. But naturally during the day, we're going to experience these periods where we're more alert, where we're actually better suited to do more focus work, and periods where we're less alert, we're a bit more distracted, and also periods where our energy is lower. So if you're more of a strong morning type, you likely experience that variation as a peak in the morning, followed by a valley in the middle of the day, and then a rebound when your energy and alertness starts to recover towards the end of the day, but not to the same level as it was at the beginning of the day. If you're more of a strong night owl, an evening type, you probably start the day with a rebound, takes a while to get going, you still experience this valley in the middle of the day, and then your peak period comes later in the day into the evening. Now, I recognize this isn't always possible, but my encouragement to people is there a way, even 1 or 2 days a week, that you can start to align different types of work with those different phases in your day? So align that peak period, whenever it is, with what I sometimes describe as high cognitive gear work. Now, this is like a high intensity training zone if you're using heart rate monitor or something. But this is the work in a cognitive context that's characterized by sustained attention, focus, your most complex work. And make that coincide, if possible, with that peak period. And then break that period down into blocks of focus, maybe with brief recoveries, to accept the fact that you won't be able to sustain attention indefinitely. In that rebound period, where your energy is starting to bounce back, which many people is in the afternoon, it might be at the start of the day for more strong late types, that's a great opportunity for the less complex work, either meetings, emails, switching between tasks. And then the valley, where most people experience this big energy dip, and a lot of that, it doesn't actually relate as much to what we eat at lunch, funnily enough. It's more about our circadian rhythm and actually the interaction between two systems which govern our periods of alertness and wakefulness and sleepiness. But regardless, that period of dip in energy is a great opportunity for a more extended break, which I think we used to call a lunch break, but in many places has become extinct. And that simple process of being aware of those rhythms and trying to align work and rest in a workday with them, even if we can't do it completely, makes a really positive difference for many people, rather than doing what many of us do, which is just to try and push through all day, but often exist in what I sometimes describe as a state of constant partial attention, where we're never really, really focused, we're never really, really recovering. And that intentionality can really have a transformative effect for many people, again, improving well-being and performance in the process.
Do you think, James, that's how people use, let's say, a legal drug like coffee? What are your views on that? Is that what people are trying to do there, where they may have a dip, so they'll have coffee to like take away that natural bit? And what are your views on that? Is that bad? Is it good? Like or am I totally misinterpreting what you just said?
No, not at all. Because I think coffee is one of the world's, if not the world's, most used psychoactive substance. So it's a really powerful chemical, actually. And its main effect is to block the receptor sites in our brain for a molecule called adenosine. So adenosine accumulates in our brain during the day, this molecule, and it increases something called sleep pressure. And so you can imagine that there's a sand timer, a metaphorical sand timer that fills up the sleep pressure during the day. And the sand is actually these adenosine molecules which are attaching to the surface, to the receptors in our brain, making us feel sleepy. So what caffeine does, it blocks those receptor sites, so we don't sense that increasing sleep pressure. And so it can be very effective. If you're starting to feel sleepy, you can basically block those receptor sites by having a coffee or a caffeinated drink and decrease that sense of sleepiness. The problem is that people think that caffeine is a performance enhancer, but arguably it's actually a performance restorer. So if people have slept adequately, so they don't have a lot of sleep pressure, then caffeine doesn't actually seem to really improve cognitive performance over and above baseline levels. So many of us end up using caffeine as a crutch because we're not sleeping enough and we're trying to cope with this excessive sleep pressure during the day. The problem is with caffeine is that it's got quite a long half-life. Now, it does vary between individuals. The half-life is the amount of time it takes for something that's circulating in our bloodstream to reach 50% of its concentration. So it's a measure of how quickly our body gets rid of something. For most people, it's between 5-6 hours. For some people, it can be as short as 1 hour. For others, it can be as long as 9 hours. But the problem is that if we overconsume caffeine, then there can still be some of it hanging around at the end of the day, still blocking sleep pressure when we want to get to sleep. So we end up falling into this vicious cycle then where the caffeine interferes with sleep. which then means that the next day we feel more sleepy, so we end up using more caffeine, etc., etc. So what I often suggest is that not to necessarily be fearful of caffeine, but be intentional about it. Recognize it's got quite a long half-life. Be aware of the fact that sometimes we're using it as a crutch when actually we need to get to the fundamental issue, which is that we've not slept enough. And also look at other factors that might be able to boost alertness without the potential downsides of caffeine. And one of the simplest ways for many people is to think about what I sometimes describe as your light diet. How much light are your eyes metaphorically eating? Yeah. So there's a dose-response relationship between light intensity and how alert we feel. And we all naturally have this dip during often the middle of the day, and sometimes we reach for caffeine. But if you go outside, or if you can't get outside, get some blue enriched, bright artificial light, that can really boost your alertness and mean that you can feel more awake without having to resort to caffeine. So I'm not necessarily against caffeine. I've got some caffeine today, and I love coffee. But I think many of us would benefit from just being a bit more aware about the upsides relative to the downsides, and making sure that we're not putting a sticking plaster on some more fundamental issues.
James, that is such a helpful way of looking at it. And once again, you're not going to the extremes of demonizing something. You're trying to understand it, which has been really helpful. One thing we see in our verbatim comments quite a lot within the happiness index is I'm really finding it hard to switch off. Regenerative downtime. Can you improve your ability to unwind? We see a lot of, again, we touched on social, email. Like you think before email, when you left work, you left work. But no matter how much we like to think about it, you could have a boss that emails you at 11 p.m. at night with something that you read. Also, we have to remember people are working on different time zones. We work in different time zones at the happiness index. So someone might send me something at 9 a.m, but it might be late for me. Can regenerative help? Anything on this? On can we learn to switch off, James?
I think we definitely can learn to get better at switching off. And I think it's also true to say, as you pointed out, that many of us struggle with it. Often we also get caught in what's sometimes described as the recovery paradox. So that was a term that was coined by a researcher called Sabine Sonnentag, who's an academic researcher who's done a lot of research and work in this space. And the recovery paradox describes how often recovery is most challenging to experience when we need to recover the most. And we've all probably felt that, after the most demanding days, when you've been on the go all day and you're desperate to switch off at the end of the day, that's when it's often hardest to quiet our minds and to wind down and decompress. And unfortunately, that's why many people often end up resorting to, a glass of wine or a beer to try and shortcut that process, which is maybe something else we can talk about. But the good news is we can learn to switch off, and it's vital that we do. There's some really interesting research that describes, for example, that for leaders specifically, when leaders are better able to experience a sense of mental distance from their work, which is described as psychological detachment. That's the kind of the way we describe that academically. When people can experience that psychological detachment, they're better able to express themselves as a leader and express effective leadership the following day. But when we look at how you do that, it can be quite helpful to think about a framework where we look at ways that we can get better at switching off and winding down. And again, Sabine Sonnentag has done some quite interesting research here, and she's got a framework called the Recovery Experiences Framework. And you can almost imagine it like a checklist of experiences that you might look for to try and help you to wind down and eventually experience that sense of mental distance. One of the aspects of that framework is simply relaxation. It's so intuitive, isn't it? But doing something proactively, putting yourself in an environment where you can experience a decrease in both physical and psychological cognitive load. And so, that might mean going somewhere, going for a walk. Many people find walking a dog, for example, can be really helpful for that. But doing something where you create a situation, a context where your cognitive load and physical load will be able to reduce. The second one is described as mastery experiences. And this is really interesting because this describes how sometimes to switch off, we actually need to switch over. And so if you're struggling to stop thinking about work, the worst thing you can often do is try to stop thinking about work, because you can experience something called the ironic rebound effect if you do that. So, for example, if I was to say, whatever you do, Matt, don't picture a pink elephant right now. Well, of course, the thing that pops into your head is a pink elephant.
So running around everywhere, James.
Exactly. So the mastery experiences describe experiences where we experience a sense of progress, of learning. Hobbies are a great example of things which give us an experience of mastery, ideally that's non-work related. And that switching over process can actually help us to detach from work. Related to that, the third aspect or dimension of recovery experiences is control. And this describes how important it is to be able to deploy our energy and use our time that's in a way that's aligned with what we want to do. And that's often quite different to what we've experienced in work. And this is really, really difficult often for people who've got caregiving responsibilities, whether that's kids, whether it's aging parents, whether it's pets. But trying to create even small blocks of time where even if it's 15 minutes, you can do something that you want to do. It might be just sticking on some noise cancelling headphones and reading something that you want to read for 10 minutes. And the final aspect is psychological detachment. That's the fourth dimension of recovery experiences, which it describes that sense of mental distance. But I think they are related, and they offer a kind of checklist or roadmap where if you do find opportunities to engage in those experiences, you are much more likely to get to that endpoint and experience the sense of mental distance that we need to be able to recover, recharge, and then bounce back so we can ideally do our best work again the next day.
It's fascinating, James. I mean, I've spoken about this many times before, but the main reason I gave up alcohol is because I used it as a shortcut reference. I used it as a shortcut to switch off from the stress. But I found that all it did is it pushed the stress down the line, and I'd wake up at 3 in the morning thinking about it. And the other thing that I reflected on when you were talking is I cannot, even though you've got this incredible book out, Regenerative Performance, I cannot read anything when I'm trying to relax that is broadly related to my work. So I will definitely go and buy your book because I enjoy what you stand for in your content and your research, but I will be intentional about when I read it. So I use reading as a way to switch over, but it has to be something totally not related. Otherwise the curiosity bit switches on again. So I was reflecting so much on some of the points you said there, and it brings me on to another, which is linked to alcohol. Is one of the impact of using alcohol to switch off for me was a lack of sleep. And then it was on impact when I had less sleep, then I was having more coffee and all of these things that you talk about. So I'd like to go into, and I just want to quote my business partner, who I think I mentioned this to you when we were planning this episode, so the question is regenerative sleep, how to care about sleep without obsessing. Now, my business partner got into the habit of tracking everything because we had the habit of stuff, is kind of what we do. And he started tracking his sleep. But I asked him about it a little while ago, and he said, I've stopped tracking my sleep. And I said, why have you stopped tracking your sleep? And he said, because when I saw my data that I'd slept well, I felt good. And when my data showed me that I hadn't slept well, I didn't feel good. And he felt that his data was deciding how he felt. So he actually stopped, because he said there are times when he hasn't had good sleep and he can just crack on. And actually there's sometimes when he has what the app would say is good sleep and he doesn't feel great. So he actually stopped tracking it. So I just wanted to give a bit of context on the question, but the question is how to care about sleep without obsessing about sleep.
Well, it's ironic, isn't it, that in one way we know more about sleep, or we think we know more about sleep than we ever have before, but still a restful night's sleep eludes so many of us. And depending on the stats that you look at, it seems that maybe 45% of people are struggling with their sleep to some degree. And I do think that these wearable devices are a double-edged sword. And one of the reasons that they're a challenge is related to another cognitive bias called precision bias. And this describes how we often assume that precision belies accuracy. So if you present a very precise number or statistic to someone, people generally assume that is a result of careful measurement. And the problem with wearables is that very few of them have got any kind of robust validation, which means that we don't necessarily know whether they are measuring what we think they're measuring. And they're also their reliability is quite low. So we don't necessarily know whether they'll measure that thing consistently, even if it is measuring the thing that we think it's measuring. And there's quite a lot of data, some published literature, which describes how inaccurate many of these measures can be, particularly when it comes to sleep staging, for example. So sleep staging data, which will describe time that we spend in REM or non-REM sleep, at an individual level from wearables is highly inaccurate, to the point that some would argue that it's practically useless, despite what some wearable manufacturers would say. They are generally pretty accurate for sleep duration and sleep timing. So telling you the amount of time that you spent asleep and the time that you went to bed and the time that you woke up. But even if they are accurate for that, you raised a really important point, and your colleague did, which is that we are incredibly vulnerable to our perception of how we slept, regardless of its accuracy. And there's a great study that illustrated this. And one of the co-authors on it was the guy who's been my mentor in this sleep space, a guy called Professor Stephen Lockley, who's one of the world's most published academics in sleep and circadian rhythm science. And one of his colleagues was doing a study where they were looking at sleep deception. And so this means that you give people false feedback about how long they slept for, and then you measure the effects. And in this case, they were using a system called polysomnography, which actually measures, it's the gold standard for sleep measurement, and it includes measures of brain activity, the electrical activity of the brain. And so you can really trust these measures. And Steve was very cynical about the potential for sleep deception to actually affect the electrical activity of the brain. Because it's one thing to say, I feel like this, have a psychological experience. It's very different for the brain to respond in a different way, because that's something that we can't fake. So he ended up betting his colleague that the sleep deception might affect how people feel. So if you told, and this has been shown in other studies, that if you tell someone that they slept longer, they feel like they slept longer. But it turned out, much to my colleague's kind of amusement and perhaps even disappointment to some extent, well, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but that if you tell people that they slept longer than they actually did, their brain at a neurophysiological level, so in terms of picking up on brainwave frequencies, their brain responds like a more awake brain if you simply tell them that they've slept longer. And other research bears this out, that if you tell people that they sleep less, they've slept less, or they've slept worse in terms of sleep quality, and if you prime them by telling them, for example, you should spend this much amount of time in REM sleep, but you slept less, then they feel and perform like they have slept less or slept worse. And this all relates to something called placebo sleep. So I'm really concerned, actually, that we're en masse, we're doing this experiment where many people are now tracking their sleep. Often they believe those data that they're presented with. And like your colleague, it sounds, they're finding that depending on what the wearable says, they feel better or worse. And often don't even recognize that those data might be completely incorrect. So I often encourage people to just be mindful of those effects. And personally, I do measure my sleep, but I tend to look at it as a trend over time rather than fixating on it day to day. And so, for example, with my wearable, I'll look at my average sleep from week to week and see, am I trending in a good direction, a bad direction? Am I keeping it stable, rather than checking in every day and making myself vulnerable to those effects? Because the reality is, you mentioned I've just got back from the States. There were some times there where sleep wasn't ideal. There was social commitments, professional commitments, other things. If I woke up in the morning and saw my wearable, I would undoubtedly see that my sleep had been too short and low quality. That's only going to have a negative effect. So what's the point? So I'm not against wearables by any means. I use them a lot in my research and my professional life, but many of us would benefit from being a bit more aware of the potential downsides as well as the upsides, which there are many of those as well.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating, James. I was going to we've got 4 questions left. I was going to cut 2 out, but actually what I'm going to do is increase the pace, because I couldn't kill any of these questions. So we're going to have 2 minutes of questions. So I'm just going to hit them with you quickly. Regenerative fitness. What is it, James, and why is it important?
So regenerative fitness is my response to the challenge that we see that we are exercising in a structured way more than ever, yet sedentary time is increasing and actually health for many people is getting worse. And I think we've fallen into this trap of fixating on really structured exercise, like going to the gym, and forgetting about the fact that many of us spend excessive time sitting, for example. And so regenerative fitness is a way of looking at our physical fitness in a bigger picture sense. And so recognizing that there are different dimensions to this, and over time trying to make sure that we tick off all those boxes and those dimensions. And to cut a long story short, in the interest of your quick fire questions, I encourage people to think about starting off with a foundation of simply moving more, which means paying attention to sedentary time and trying to break up that sedentary time, which can improve both physical and mental health and well-being. Secondly, it's about finding ways to move slow, and that's a way of talking about lower intensity aerobic exercise and recognizing that, while people say more pain, no gain, no pain, no gain, that's not actually true. There's huge benefits from even just going for a walk around the park, for example, or around the office block where you work. Building on top of that, some moving fast, and by moving fast, I mean this kind of sprinkling of high intensity exercise, because we know that even these really brief sessions, 10 minutes featuring brief 6-second sprints, all out sprints, are associated with huge benefits metabolically, which describes all the chemical reactions in our body, cardiovascularly, and psychologically as well, in boosting mental health. And then moving heavy, and that talks about resistance exercise, because we know that once we hit 30, unfortunately, we do start to lose muscle mass and strength. And one of the best things we can do to have a healthy long life is to do some resistance exercise. And the final pillar is moving together, which really recognizes the huge benefits of group exercise or exercising with a friend. We go further, we go faster, and we often enjoy it more too because it feels easier. And so regenerative fitness in a nutshell is thinking about those dimensions: moving more, moving slow, moving fast, moving heavy, moving together, and not trying to fit that into every week, but month to month, trying to tick off those boxes.
I always think about that when I see a car park at a gym and how many people have driven to the gym. And I always think, would it be better to actually cycle to the gym and do less time in the gym and cycle back, but your overall exercise time has increased because you've used the time it took? But I've got to get on to my next question. This is another one that often comes up with fitness: regenerative nutrition. Every single day I'm reading what's going to kill me and what's going to make me healthy, and sometimes those lists flip within a week. How do we cut through the noise of all this, James?
Yeah, I mean, it's a real challenge, isn't it? And one of the challenges is driven by the fact that nutrition research is really hard to do, because you basically have a choice of either trying to control everything in the lab, which doesn't really translate to the real world, or get people to self-report in the real world. And human beings are really bad at that, for a combination of reasons. We have bad memories, and we're also vulnerable to something called social desirability bias. So even if it's not an anonymized survey, we tend to respond in a way which we think will make us be perceived better by other people. So this means there's a lot of conflicting advice. But for me, a lot of nutritional principles come down to some fundamentals. And I probably couldn't say it much better than Michael Pollan said more than 10 years ago, which is eat real food, mostly plants, not too much. And if you do that, you're basically probably 90% of the way there. And I dive quite deep into this in the book and go into some of the science around it. But in the interest of time, that is how I'd leave it for today.
That's a good plug for the book. Go and read that book. Got 2 more questions. We've got 6 minutes. So we've still got 2 minutes each. So regenerative mindset, how do we learn to thrive under pressure?
So this is really about thinking about how we perceive and respond to stress. Because I think, again, one of the challenges at the moment is that we see this quite polarized response to stress, where people are telling us either just crush it, ignore stress, it's all in your mind, forget about it, just keep going. And that's less common now, it's still there. What I see more of increasingly is this idea that stress is inherently harmful. We need to protect ourselves, protect your peace. And there's truth in kind of both of these statements, but they're both extremes. And this idea is that actually we don't need to fear stress. We can actually transform it into a fuel for growth, depending on whether you perceive stress as a challenge or a threat. Also, depending on whether we have the resources available to respond healthily to that stress. Some of that is about how we view stress. It's also about the social support that we might feel and the skills and the capacity that we might have. But really, that whole notion is about, again, avoiding these extremes of either saying ignore stress or be fearful of stress, actually finding ways to navigate it in a way that's going to support both well-being and performance. And again, there's some really good evidence to describe how to do that. And I break that down. There's a great researcher called Alia Crum at Stanford who's done a lot of research in that space, if anyone wants to dig into it.
Thanks, James. Last one is around regenerative growth. There is a whole world out there now, again, books telling us how to grow. And sometimes I meet people, they're doing so much of all the stuff that you're supposed to do. they're waking up, they're meditating every day, and they're doing everything. But they're deeply unhappy, and they're just not feeling satisfied with their life. Like, what's going on? Like, there seems to be more advice than ever. But how can regenerative growth help cut through all of this, James?
Well, I think again, there's been a kind of an overemphasis on some fundamentals, which actually, if we don't overemphasize them, they're really good, they're really positive. And I sometimes describe them based on the most enduring model in well-being and human thriving, which is called self-determination theory. And it describes how our three core needs as humans are autonomy, competence, and relatedness. So, autonomy, again, having that sense of freedom and being able to deploy our time and energy in a way that's aligned with our values, what we want to do. Competence, feeling that sense of growth and improvement and mastery, and relatedness, that sense of connection with others. But the self-improvement world has actually distorted some of those. It's distorted autonomy by saying that growth is all about doing it yourself. And actually you're going to monk mode, get your head down, just focus entirely in a very individualistic way. Around competence as well, it's that actually it's all about growth, it's all about improvement. You just need more grit, which is this passion and perseverance towards long-term goals. And that distortion means that rather than fulfilling these fundamental needs, we actually end up compromising them. We end up more isolated, we end up more tired, we end up more unfulfilled. And so, this notion of regenerative growth is really going back to those fundamental needs and looking at how we can express that need for autonomy, competence, relatedness in an integrated way, in a more dynamic way, rather than over-indexing and ending up working against the very things that we're trying to achieve.
James, I love that. We've got time to squeeze in another question. You're going in a time machine. You're going to meet the 12-year-old James. What advice would you give James?
Oh, that's a great question. I'd probably steal a quote actually from someone else, which is that we generally overestimate what we can achieve in a year and underestimate what we can achieve in 10 years. And I've always been quite driven and impatient, and 12-year-old James was still expressing those characteristics. And I just tell him it's going to be okay, and keep going.
I love that. I think that's the most common thing to answer that question, that people would tell that their past selves is going to be okay. So I think we're going to tell all our listeners today, James, based on your advice, is going to be okay. So James, I don't know how you've packed all this in, but the amount we have covered is absolutely extraordinary. If you want to go into any of these questions more deeply, they were chapters of James's book that we were using for the questions, Regenerative Performance. That's one way people can get to know you, James. They can go and read your book. Or if anyone else wants to connect with you that is interested in what you're doing, what's the other way to connect?
So if people want insights like this in their inbox every couple of weeks, I've got a free newsletter, and you can sign up to that on drjameshewitt.com, my website. And then I'm also pretty active on LinkedIn, and I'd welcome the conversation to continue there. And then I'm also starting to do a bit more on Instagram, where you get a bit of a behind the scenes. But any of those channels, I'd really welcome the opportunity to connect with your audience, and really curious, surprisingly enough, what they've got to say.
James, this is the exact type of conversation that I was hoping for, and I hope our listeners have learned as much as I have. Thank you on behalf of myself and our listeners.
Oh, thank you, Matt.